Hi, Judy from Bungalow Quilting, and today let's talk about partial seams in quilting. Partial seams happen when you have a central patchwork piece and you have units that rotate around that central piece. So you have a hard time understanding, if I'm going to stitch this to this, where does this have this seam allowance? How does this happen when this hasn't even been sewn on there yet, right? So you're going to stitch this to the central piece, this to the central piece, this unit, and this unit. But you got to start somewhere, and this piece would be loose and hanging off because this one hasn't happened yet. So we're going to talk about how this works and how you can make this simple and fun. There are two very important keys to success when doing partial seams, and also for doing a lot of other seams when you have a corner that you have to stitch in perfectly. And those two keys are that you stitch 1/4 of an inch from the edge when you start, and you stop 1/4 of an inch from the bottom when you stop. You don't start at this very edge of the fabric and just start sewing straight across. You're actually going to start sewing your seam allowance at 1/4 of an inch away from the end of the piece of fabric. And the second key piece to this is that you are always going to press your seam allowances open. That's really, really important that you press those seam allowances open when you're doing partial seams. So I'm going to stop. And if you feel like you absolutely have to backstitch, don't backstitch more than maybe 1 or 2 stitches. So if you absolutely have to backstitch, make sure you backstitch no more than 1 or 2 stitches. So you see how I started 1/4 of an inch away from there and I ended 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. And you're going to do this with every single seam allowance in this block. Okay, so this is one of 4 units that you're going to be making for this block. And you won't be able to chain piece when you do a unit for a block that is a partial seam block. But remember, not every single quilt you make is going to be a quilt that has blocks with partial seams. So this is applying only to the blocks with partial seams. So every single one of your ends of your seams should look like this. There should be a little opening because you only stitched to 1/4 inch away from the end. See that little opening there? Every single seam allowance should have that. And when you do that, it allows you to have that nice little fan thing going on right here. I'll move this better to the middle of the screen. It allows you to have that nice fanning effect when you press your seam allowances open. So two things for success. One is to stop 1/4 inch before and start 1/4 inch before the edge of the fabric. The other one is to press your seam allowances open. And that is what is the beginning unit right here. There's 4 of these units for this block. All right, so let's move on and see how we're going to join these. So now my 4 units are done, and these are going to have to rotate around a central square that's on point. And so then we're going to start out by stitching this to this, and we're going to have an entire, we won't have a partial seam here, we'll have a total entire seam here. But if we're stitching this to this is going to still be hanging off. So what we're going to do is continue to use the methods that I've talked about, where you start 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the block and stop 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the piece, not block, I'm sorry, the piece, and press the seam allowances open, because that's going to be really important when you go to sew that last piece on. So then this is a complete seam here to here. And then this is where the incomplete seam gets joined to this one. So this is a complete seam, but then this would be the partial seam. All right, so we're going to break that down even a little bit further on the sewing machine. So here's that first step in the process. I've stitched this to the central square, and this little piece here is open like that. Let me see if I can zoom in So you can see how I stopped 1/4 inch from my end there, because it's going to be a pivot point. That's going to be important. That is a pivot point. Okay, now that next piece is on, and again we have that wonderful fanning thing that happens when you stop sewing 1/4 inch from the edge and start sewing 1/4 inch from the edge. And when you press your seam allowances open, you get this really nice fanning effect that happens, and that keeps those seam allowances so nice and flat. See how that is? All right, so next step in the process is to stitch. Let's back it out a little bit here. Is to stitch. So we've got 1 here where the partial seam is going to go. We've got 2 here, and then we're going to put our next unit right alongside here, and that'll be a complete and not a partial seam. Okay, now comes the partial seam. So this has to get sewn to here and then to here. So this gets sewn right sides together like this. We're going to pin it. I'll take it over to the sewing machine and show you how I'm going to do this, okay? We're going to pin this along here and then stitch and then stop. And then we're going to have a pivot point, and I'll show you how that's done. Okay, so now this is that seam that's going to get sewn here. And then the partial seam is going to happen here. Now I've got my pins way over here, and that's why it's not flipping over to match up. I like to keep my pins in when I sew. Remember how I said that? Because it adds stability. So what I did though was I am going to stitch it from this side. I'm going to stitch it from the side with all the seam allowances, because I want to start 1/4 inch in. This is actually where I want to start to stitch. See that? See how that little square of that brown fabric is sticking out there? I want to start my stitching right there, because that's going to be my pivot point, and it's also 1/4 inch away from the edge of the red square. And I'm going to start there, and I'm going to go all the way down to here. Okay, so here we go. 1/4 inch from the end, which is right in the middle of all those seam allowances. And I am going to go forward and back stitch 1. My 1/4 inch seam. And go all the way down to the end. Stop again, right in the middle of that seam allowance, which is 1/4 inch from the end. All right. Just ran out of bobbin thread too, timely. Okay, so now we have it, the moment this whole video is about. So I've pressed the seam allowance open, all right? We've still got this little bit right here to sew. So how are we going to do that? Well, now we're going to do this little pivot business here, where this is sewn, and now we do this partial one, and we bring this white piece around to meet the brown piece. Oop, it's tricky. It's a little bit tricky. Okay. Now we're going to start pinning. Oops. Pin. And then this gets pivoted there so that it's flat. And you start stitching. Well, it's not exactly flat. Let's try from the other side. This is what you have to do. You have to work it. You have to play with it. There we go. That's better. So now we're going to, let's pin it from this side. There we go. And then we're going to take it up to, it's kind of like a set-in seam. There we go. So we're going to take it up to the point here where then we're going to stop 1/4 inch from the edge there. okay? You just have to kind of work it. You got to work that pivot. And that's the reason we kept those 1/4 inch edges unsewn. All right, we're gonna work it so that we've pivoted it, and we're gonna stitch it and stop at that 1/4 inch right there. Okay, let's do it. And this is gonna take some pressing. And all along, when you're using this system of pressing seam allowances open, I would definitely recommend using a starch. Starch won't keep things from stretching. They will not keep things from stretching. They will, however, flatten things out nicely. All right, so we're gonna stop at the 1/4 inch. We're gonna backstitch 1. We're gonna see, oh, my foot got caught. And then we're gonna see how this is going to look. All right, so we're gonna go back and we're gonna press that because it is a little bumpy, right? But we're gonna go back and we're gonna press that out, press that seam allowance open. Let's take a look how that's gonna look once we press that seam allowance open and get those seam allowances all going in the right direction. I think it's gonna look pretty good. Hey, there's the block. And our partial seam, can you tell which one it was? No matter what way we turn this, we shouldn't be able to tell which one it was. And once you get more of these blocks put together, you start to see a primary, a secondary, and a tertiary design. Let me show you. I got another one over here that's sewn. That is really pretty. Isn't that pretty? Pretty blocks. Very pretty blocks. I love the way that this rotates and looks. All right, well, thanks for watching this video, and I hope that this helps to clear up partial seams and why you need them.